my heart transplanted in a place that scored a C? No, ma'am, no, sir. Today on the Transplant Helper, we're going to be discussing the following headline. Trump administration proposes weakening rules governing organ transplant centers. Stay tuned. Hey folks, welcome to Transplant Helper today. My name is Jim Merle, and today we're going to be doing something I rarely do on the program, and that is pausing for just a few moments to discuss kind of a current event, something that's going on in our world right now. And this basically today has to do with an article that's circulating all over the internet. I suppose it's really especially circulating on Facebook and probably has already made the national news as far as it goes. And it has to do with the basic headline that I just read a moment ago. I'll reread now. The Trump administration proposes a weakening of rules governing organ transplant centers. Now, if you've not already read this article, I'll be sure to put it in the description below this video. You can go down there in that description and click on the link and check it out for yourself. It's basically about a 2 to 6 minute read, depending on what kind of reader you are. For me, probably more like 8. But anyway, it's a pretty lengthy read, but it basically goes to say this, and I'll read the first paragraph or so you can get a gist for it. Here's what it says. Revised rules proposed this week as a part of the agency's efforts to reduce the, quote, burdensome federal regulations would no longer penalize hospitals if too many of their patients die following transplants. St. Luke's in Houston recently lost its Medicare funding for heart transplants for that very reason. The article goes on to read, the Trump administration proposed this week eliminating the decade-old regulation that puts hospitals at risk for losing their Medicare funding if too many of their patients die or suffer organ failure after receiving transplants. Of course, that's referring to organ transplants. The paragraph next goes on to say the rule for this government proposing to scrap is the same rule that led centers for Medicare and Medicaid services being cut off funding last month for heart transplants at Baylor St. Luke's Medical Center in Houston after they were investigated by ProPublica, and the Houston Chronicle revealed an outstanding number of patients' deaths and complications in recent years. The proposed was unveiled Monday as a part of the White House's push to, quote, cut the red tape and do away with the burdensome regulations. The officials said the paperwork was put ahead of the patients, and in a speech announcing this proposal, changes to the CMS, that Centers for Medicaid Services Administration, Seema Verma said the agency's existing policies had put lives in danger. We're proposing that we remove those insufficiencies to reduce the amount of time, here's the key, to reduce the amount of time patients have to wait so that they can begin healing, Verma said. Now, I'm not going to read the rest of the article. You can look it up here, follow the links. You can read it all for yourself. But anyway, basically the article just continues on to argue back and forth about the potential that if some of these, quote, regulations, burdensome regulations were cut and centers were not being penalized for patient deaths following transplants, that there would be more organ transplants. And so they go through a big argument about that, and it really kind of got my wheels to turning. Now, let me say in the beginning of this, I realize that what I'm about to say in the next few moments is probably going to be pretty opinionated, okay? But I am someone, as a heart transplant recipient of 2013, I have been there and I'm currently doing that. I'm friends with tons of you, both through this medium here on YouTube, who follow the Transplant Helper, who are part of the Transplant Helper community, as well as tons of you over on Facebook and various different transplant groups. And so I kind of have a feel. I kind of have my if you will, my fingers on the pulse of what we're feeling. And I thought it was something we could bring together and discuss. And so I basically want to break this down by telling you a few things. In the first place, I want to tell you it is my dream, and certainly I'm sure I share this with many of you, it is my dream that something could be done somewhere, somehow, in order to get everybody who's waiting on organ transplanted like they need that to happen. If you know, that would be absolutely great. If no one of the hundreds of thousands of people who are right now currently waiting on the transplant list had to pass or to die waiting on transplant. If everybody got what they wanted, and those transplants were successful. Now, I think that's the key in this, and we're going to mention this again later. The transplants need to be done, but they need to be successful. Well, you ask Jim, what do you believe to be a successful transplant? Well, there are two things involved in a successful transplant. Number one, it has to involve an increased or improved quality of life. If you getting an organ transplant makes you feel like you did before the transplant, really no better, then it wasn't worth getting, okay? So it has to improve quality of life. Number two, it also has to increase the longevity of life. You know, transplant itself is a gift. It is a blessing, but it's all about extending life beyond what we would have had otherwise. Organ failure is just that, is an organ that has failed, and eventually that organ that's failed you is going to cause your whole body to fail. I don't know how many times I've seen people who are in organ failure, say, for example, for their heart, and before long their lungs follow suit, or before long their kidneys follow suit, or before long, even after that, their liver follows suit. So eventually, you know, if we don't meet with transplant, our lives are going to be cut shorter, and I emphasize the on that, shorter perhaps, than they would have been. So I hope, I pray that something, whatever it is, can be done to decrease wait time and increase organ donation just to make that possible. Now, one of the things that has to be done aside from those two things, making that successful transplant, is you have to have availability, which I've already mentioned. The organs have to be there, and then you have to have capability. And I mean by that, there has to be capable transplant centers that are able to do these procedures and able to perform them at that same successful rate that I just talked about. So it's my dream, your dream I know as well, that everybody could be transplanted. However, this little proposal that's being thrown out there, not really little, that government regulations be cut, particularly when it comes to the Medicare regulations be cut, and that transplant centers stop being penalized for too many patient deaths, I'm not exactly sure that that's the way to go about this. Yes, we need some changes as far as donor awareness. We need some changes as far as, allowing people to have transplants. Every insurance policy should allow such. There should be funding for such. There should be staffing for such. But I don't know that backing off of penalties for patient deaths, folks, we're talking about people dying here, is going to be the way to go. Now, with that said, that was all kind of introduction. Let me mention a few things about the average transplant center. And by this, I mean average. So you may say to yourself, well, that's not the way my transplant center works, or that's not the way my transplant center thinks. I understand that. I'm talking about average transplant centers. When it comes to average transplant centers, there are basically a few things they need to be aware of, as well as they need to be considering as being a transplant center. Number one, understand that being a transplant center comes with recognition. And that's the first big word I put here right across the screen right now. It has to have to do with recognition, okay? Being a transplant center can get you noted, can get you recognized, can get you in the spotlight around the world, really, for whatever you do. And I'll use some examples of that. I look at my transplant center, UAB Hospital, Birmingham, Alabama, and I know that they're probably not much different than yours, but I look at them as the premier hospital in the state of Alabama. I look at them as the people who, if they can do a transplant, they can do anything. I have people all the time ask me, say, Jim, I'm having some heart trouble. I've been told by my local cardiologist I need to have, I need to have a bypass, or I need to have a stent placed, or I need to have some sort of a procedure done. Where do you recommend I have that done? And I say, hands down, UAB Hospital, Birmingham, Alabama. Why? Because the recognition is there that if they can perform a transplant, taking an organ out, putting it to the side, putting a brand new organ in completely, I think they can handle everything else. And so hospitals all over the world, I suppose, they want to be recognized for their medical care. No hospital wants to have a poor rating. No hospital wants to be known as the do-nothing hospital, or the hospital that's not capable of good health care. They're all about health care. So they want that recognition. And simply being called a transplant center gives you recognition, okay? Just like in the days gone by, there are still some that exist, but being called a trauma center gives you recognition. This is something that's really, notable about different facilities and hospitals. So one of the things they need to be aware of, and we need to be aware of, that they desire, is recognition. Number two, understand that transplant itself, and it doesn't matter if it's heart, lung, liver, kidney, pancreas, cornea, whatever, intestine, Transplants themselves bring reward. And again, that's the second word we're going to put across the screen here, reward. They bring reward. And they mean that in several different areas, but mainly I'm talking about here in financial areas, okay? Being a transplant center and performing organ transplants is a very profitable, if you will, financial type thing. Now, am I saying that it doesn't cost these centers to do transplants? No, I know it's expensive. I know they have costs involved. But overall, you would probably go ahead and understand that giving transplants, offering transplants themselves is a very profitable or rewarding type business. Now, we're going to pause for just a moment. I'm going to show you a few things just for illustration here so we can understand this and make some comparisons. So I've got my buddy right here, my Google Home, laying here beside me, so hopefully you'll be able to hear. Let me ask him a couple of questions, and I'll turn right back to you and use that for illustration. Okay, Google. How much does it cost to have your tonsils removed?
On the website health.costhelper.com, they say, for those not covered by health insurance, a tonsillectomy, with or without an adenoidectomy, typically costs from $4,153 to $6,381, with an average cost of $5,442, according to Blue Cross Blue Shield of North Carolina.
Okay, hang on. Let's try something else. Okay, Google. How much does it cost to have your appendix removed?
On the website cbsnews.com, they say, a 2009 study showed that appendix removals around the U.S. can range from $1,500 all the way up to $180,000. On average, the surgery costs about $33,000.
Okay. One more, I promise. Be patient. Okay, Google. How much does it cost to have an organ transplant?
On the website fortune.com, they say, consulting firm Milliman tallies the average costs of different organ transplants in the U.S. And while most are expensive, some are very expensive. A kidney transplant runs just over $400,000.
Did you hear that? Now, I'm going to put a graphic up here on the screen right now for just a moment. You can look at it for yourself. But you'll see that every type of transplant is expensive. The least expensive, I should say, that you can have is a cornea transplant. And and I'm not taking anything away from the beauty, the blessedness of having sight, but you know as well as I do, a cornea transplant is not nearly as involved as any of the other organs in our body. And so you can get up as high on the heart side of the $1.4 million range. Now, you go all the way back to something that Google helped us with a few moments ago when they mentioned that you could have your tonsils taken out for several $1,000s. I don't remember the number now, but several $1,000s, like $4,000-$6,000 versus any of these transplants. They are much more profitable. So I'm just kind of making an argument here that every transplant center that's out there, they want recognition, number one. They want reward, number two. They are in it not just for the money, but they are definitely in it for money because it is a profitable business being in the transplant realm of things. But let me remind them of one more thing, and that is not only should we consider the recognition and the reward, I'll put this up on the screen, we should also consider, and they should consider. Yeah, I'm talking to you, St. Luke's, Baylor St. Luke's, I'm talking to all of you. You should consider the regulations too, okay? Go ahead and consider, and we need to consider, I need to consider, these places have to be regulated. Let me say that very clearly again. These transplant centers have to be regulated. Now, you could argue as far as who should do that regulation, how it should be done, how it should be implemented. I get that. We're not all going to agree on that, and I'm sure there's really no perfect way to control that, okay? I get that. But we do understand as patients, as recipients, as potential recipients, maybe you're watching this video pre-transplant, we also understand that these places, these centers, these organ transplants, they have to be regulated, okay? Someone has to oversee this, and that someone has to be, whether you want it to be the government necessarily in name or not, it has to be someone outside of that center. Because if the transplant center is being allowed, just for lack of better terms, to run roughshod and just toss organs here, there, and everywhere and just pass them out like they're no big deal, all for profit or all for recognition, and not during the period of regulation, we're going to have a huge failure, okay? Now, I get, as the article read there, and you go back again, it's in the description, you can read it for yourself, but I get within that first and second paragraph that I read that this person who was actually giving the speech said, well, this will help cut wait times. I get that, because what they're getting at, and I think it's a roundabout way of seeing it, but what they're saying is if there are not lots of transplant centers offering organs, if there are not lots of centers being funded, then there are not going to be lots of transplants. And that's just easy math. You know, you're going to have more transplants with more centers performing the transplants. And you understand that if those centers are not being funded by, say, for example, Medicare, they're not going to do transplants, because whether you realize it or not, Medicare is one of the biggest entities of governmental or of any type of insurance out there. They are one of the biggest payers. They do more in paying for medical procedures than anybody else. Whether you like them or not, whether you, whether you enjoy Medicare or not, they do help us out. They are an insurance type company type thing. I don't know if that's exactly the way you describe them, but they cover many of our medical costs. Anyway, so what they're basically saying is we need more centers out there willing to do transplants. We need more centers willing to do risky transplants, because, see, by them cutting the funding to these transplant centers, if they have too many patient deaths, if too many patients die within that 1 year period, and by the way, let me remind you, transplant centers are measured at the 1 year, the 3 year, and the 5 year mark. After that, it's not that they don't care about you, but they're not being judged, okay? But they got to get you that 1 year, that 3 year, and the 5 year mark to get their statuses placed where they are, to keep their funding going. And if they're not able to do that, and St. Luke's problem was they weren't getting enough patients to the 1 year mark, they're going to lose funding. And if they lose funding for those days, what's the first thing they're going to consider or think in their mind could be done? They're going to say, here we go. We're going to work hard. We're going to get our funding back. But then we're going to stop doing high-risk transplants. Then we're going to stop dealing with those sickest of patients, because those patients have a high risk of dying after transplant. You see, the number one reason why people die after transplant is not because the organ graft failed, and that does happen, don't get me wrong. It's not because the graft itself failed. It's because the patient was so sick leading into it, they just couldn't survive the whole surgery, the whole recovery, the whole, process. That's the reason patients die. And so what they're proposing is, if we keep penalizing these patients and slapping their cheeks for allowing patients to die, and we pull their funding, they're going to stop doing high-risk transplants. And let me ask you this. I don't know your situation. Look me in the eye. Was your transplant high risk or not? To an extent, they're all high risk. But some of us, I didn't have to deal with that. For some of us, our transplants were extremely high risk. Maybe some of you even had to be turned down at 1 or 2 or 3 centers, and then finally find someone across the country who said, you know what, I'll take your case. If the funding is cut and they're not willing to take your case because they only want to do the easy cases, because they only want to do the cases to where they can pretty much predict statistically that those patients are going to live, it could be a problem. Now, with that said, that's their argument. That's the Trump administration, if you want to say it's Trump, whatever. It's the Trump administration, quote from the article, who are proposing that they not be penalized for the deaths. But here's what I have to ask you then. Don't you want your transplant center being held accountable when too many people die? Wouldn't you like knowing, whoever governs it, I don't know, but would you not like knowing statistically that your transplant center where you are headed or where you have gone, that their patients statistically live and survive? Yeah, I do. You see, we need hospitals, and this is where my opinion comes in. I get it. My opinion, Jim Merle's opinion, right here, my opinion is these hospitals need to be penalized if they cannot get patients, the majority of patients, to the 1 year mark. They need to be penalized if they cannot keep these survival rates high enough in order for these entities, whether it's Medicare, whether it's private insurance, wherever it's whatever, are willing to fund them, because sometimes we don't realize this. And let me just kind of step in and say this. We typically think about the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration. We think about them doing what? Well, they govern the medications, the drugs that are being supplied to us, and determine whether or not they're safe. We think about that. We think about the CDC, the Center for Disease Control. And we say, well, they're looking out for our well-being. They're trying to prevent diseases being passed among people. They're trying to head those things off. They're trying to prepare vaccines. They're trying to make sure that, there are cures or at least potential remedies for some diseases that float around. The CDC is important. Guess what? Whether you like them or not, Medicare serves some of the same purposes that the FDA and the CDC do. And that is, they are a regulating body that says if you are not treating your patients fairly, we're not going to pay. And those centers in turn say, well, if nobody's going to pay, we're not going to do it. Yeah, that's the conclusion. And it's sad. It's sad when these centers close. It's sad when funding is cut. It's sad when things don't go right. But at the end of the day, again, my opinion, these transplant centers, if they cannot perform up to a standard, whatever that is, they don't need to be open, okay? I know many of you watching this, you had your transplant at Baylor St. Luke's in Houston. I am so thankful that you did that. You know that there are great doctors, there are great nurses, there are great coordinators, there are great care providers who love their patients and who do good work. Yes, I'm thankful for that. But if statistically your chances of survival at that 1, 3, and 5 year mark are not up to a national average, that transplant center, St. Luke's, Baylor, whoever it is, UAB, if they fall guilty of this, UAB, I'm talking to you too. If you cannot meet a standard of survival and quality of life and longevity of life for your patients, that's success. If you can't be successful, shut your program down, stop treating patients, and fix your issues. That's what needs to be done. And I don't believe that the government, the Trump administration, any administration, I don't believe the government is going to help us necessarily by saying, you know what, we'll just take away those burdensome regulations and we'll stop cutting the funding off of these transplant centers in the hopes that things will get better, because they won't. The transplant centers have to be regulated, and they have to be regulated in a proper and fair manner. Maybe the key word's fair here. I don't know. But I do believe they do need some regulation. So what have I discussed here? At first I told you I've got a dream. My dream is that everybody be transplanted successfully. They live quality and long lives. I told you there that we have to understand that transplant centers want the recognition, they want the reward, and they better want the regulation, because they deserve to get it. They have to be regulated. And I'm telling you here right now, this has been my opinion. Yours may be totally different. Again, the article is going to be in the description below this video. So if you're watching on YouTube, you won't see that if you just clicked in the Facebook link. But if you're watching on YouTube, in your YouTube app, on your desktop, on your television, whatever, you can hit a little button, a little down arrow, open up the description, click the link, read the article for yourself. And there are many articles like that. So once you read the one I linked, you'll find others, all discussing the same thing. What I'm saying is, I want you and everyone who's waiting for transplant to have the best possible life they can, to have the most likely success that they can. I don't know what you were like. When I was waiting for transplant, I looked all over the internet, and it's gotten so much easier to do. I looked at the internet and I saw the statistics. I saw one transplant center scoring this, one scoring this, and one scoring that. And to put it in layman's terms, one had an A, one had a B, one had a C. Which one was I going to? You think I was going to have my heart transplanted in a place that scored a C? No, ma'am, no, sir. What about a B? Not if I could go anywhere else. What about an A? That's what I want. I went to an A-plus center. I went to a center that had a high 80s, mid 90s, variable there a little bit, success rate in transplant. And all of you want to do the same. So let's just call on. If we're going to do anything, let's stand up together and let's say, transplant centers, whoever you are, you do me the best job you can. and you help me get life, because that's what I want. I appreciate you watching this today. Again, I know it's been opinionated. I've said that a few times. I hope you'll be willing to give your opinion. How about go ahead and start commenting below the video? Again, if you're on YouTube, you can scroll down a little bit. You'll find a comment section. Start commenting below the video. Tell me if you've seen this article. Tell me if you've thought this article through. Tell me what you thought about it. Tell me what you think about our discussion today. I would love to hear. You don't have to agree with me. You don't have to agree with the Trump administration. You don't have to agree with the Medicare providers. You don't have to agree with the physicians. You don't have to agree with anybody. Just tell me what you think, because this is really about what we think. I appreciate you pausing today. I know I've taken up a ton of your time. Thank you so much for that. I love each of you. You're great, great people. If you've already subscribed to this channel, thanks for that. If not, hit the big subscribe button right now as we close. I'll also be putting a few videos up here in the corner you can check out. You're on Facebook. Keep watching. Why not? But until next time, please stay stronger, friends.